by Professor Joel Elowsky to give us the model of what Tom's work was so much about, and that is patristic studies. Professor Elowsky is Professor of Historical Theology and Dean of Advanced Studies, also the coordinator of the International Seminary Exchange Programs at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. He's also the director of the Seminary Center for the Study of Early Christian Texts and is a researcher for the Center of Early African Christianity that we've already heard about at the Oden House in New Haven, Connecticut. And he's been a faculty member there in Concordia since 2014. And we look forward to his remarks about patristics in the 21st century. Thank you, Professor.
I think I drew the short straw here. 3 o'clock is the worst time to lecture, The students are all ready to go, right? So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I'd like to again thank the Amundsons for all your support over the years and just for your friendship, frankly. And Mike and Chris and Steve and Ken, it's just been a great experience. So patristics is what I'm going to be talking about. It's the study, as you know, of the early church and their writings. And to be honest, I knew little about the subject when I started my seminary career. I grew up in an era when church history was pretty much meant studying the book of Acts, and then skipping the next 1,500 years, right? When the church went off the rails, and until Martin Luther came on the scene and saved the day, with his 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, yeah. So, by the way, I've since come to realize that period was actually kind of important. So, I did learn through this process some very good things, shall we say. So, one of the people who introduced me to the value of the subject was Sir Henry Chadwick, actually. He came to Concordia Seminary as a guest lecturer when I was just a graduate student. This was back in the early 90s. He gave 2 lectures, actually, in September of 1991. One of them was called Mary as an Ecumenical Issue, and good luck with that at Concordia Seminary, but he tried. The other was rereading the Confessions of St. Augustine in observance of the anniversary of when Augustine was ordained presbyter in Hippo in 391. Now, the recordings actually have been preserved by our seminary library, and you can actually go on our website and still listen to that lecture. It's a beautiful experience, frankly, And I remember Professor Chadwick remarking how reluctant Augustine was to receive ordination. He said, quote, his ordination reduced him to floods of tears. And then he added, I hesitate to mention that at a seminary. So I was privileged to sit next to him actually at lunch after he had finished his lectures, and I got to talk to him a bit about my own thesis that I was developing on the history of the interpretation of the book of Obadiah, which everybody wants to be a bestseller, right? But he actually was very kind and encouraging to me in my work, even though I was writing on Obadiah. But of course, the other person who introduced me to the value of patristics was, of course, Thomas Oden, who invited me, as you heard, to work with him on the 29-volume Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. And that was not long after I had left Concordia Seminary to serve as a mission developer, starting a church in southern New Jersey. And by the way, Tom also spoke at Concordia Seminary, although it was before my time, back in March of 1983. And his topic was postmodern evangelical spirituality, where he drew very much on the fathers, introducing them to the evangelical world. And you can still listen to that lecture too, by the way. And I, of course, learned much from him, not only about the spirituality of the fathers, but also how important that spirituality was, especially for a young pastor, just starting out. But even more importantly, I learned the value and the importance of true friendship, which is in many ways, I think, the deepest spirituality, as Jesus himself told his disciples when he said, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends, And then I, of course, also remember Tom there at Drew, since we're talking about libraries, his books were so many that he was on the second floor of this house, and they actually had to move him because the floor was caving in. So they actually moved him into a basement. So So I look at both of these men as friends and fathers in the faith, fathers who have now joined the great cloud of witnesses in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And patristics was only starting to come into its own in the 80s, although Professor Chadwick had been working in the field for years, and Tom Oden was in the beginning stages of conceiving of his commentary at the time. But over the last 40 years, I think we've seen an exponential growth in interest, both in the academy and in the church. And in a community such as the Norbertines, I would think that the topic fits well with your dedication of this new library here at St. Michael's Abbey. So I'd like to take the next few minutes to speak with you about the importance, I think, of patristics for the 21st century church, which in some ways that can sound like a rather highfalutin title, but I truly believe that there are implications also not only for the church, but for the larger society and culture. As the second century epistle to Diognetus put it, what the soul is in the body, that is what Christians are in the world. The soul is dispersed through all the members of the body, and Christians are scattered through all the cities of the world, he said. And he wrote this in the 2nd century, when Christianity was still a religio illicita, an illicit or an illegal religion. And despite the sometimes hostile nature of their society and culture, Christians were still called to be the influencers of their age. And I find this increasingly important, especially when, if you have seen the news lately, my sister Lutheran Church in Finland, for instance, has been put on trial for some of its views that are very much in accord with the ancient church and the historic faith of our fathers. The attempt is to make Lutheranism the religio illicita of 21st century Finland. And even after Christianity became tolerated and legal under Constantine, and even more influential as the religion of the empire under Theodosius I, it still faced the challenge of needing to make the case for its relevance in the face of heresy and continued opposition from Jews and pagans alike. So the subject of patristics is vast, and I could never do it justice as a whole. And if you go to the North American Patristic Society meetings or the ones held every 4 years in Oxford, you'll see a whole range of topics that run the gamut from Gnosticism to 4th century Orthodoxy to sessions on apophatic theology or gender studies on female ascetics. Many of these are of particular interest to subgroups in the academy. But my focus this afternoon is not so much on the academy as on the church. And the role that these ancient pastors, these fathers in the faith, played in the lives of their people. And so I'd like to narrow in on 4 areas, the 4 questions really that I believe can speak to our own age, because they speak to every age. So when I say the 21st century, I could say any century, frankly, but I do think that these are some questions that we need to look at. They're not dealing with the latest fads that churches are adopting, or more to do with what I think are timeless universal concerns the faith of our fathers shared. So first of all, how do we live in a world where we are essentially strangers? We're pilgrims looking towards that other yet undiscovered country. And secondly, what resources are at our disposal in the spiritual battles that we face and every generation faces anew? Third question is the one that I would like to spend a little more time on. Who is Jesus? And again, that's a simple question, but as we heard from Judith Heron's lecture, there's a lot there in that simple question. But one that is central to our existence as the people of God. The answer lies in the differing narratives that have been offered, the overarching scopus that the fathers would talk about, the hypothesis that tells the story of God coming into the world for us and for our salvation. I mean, that's the phrase in the Nicene Creed that's at the center of that creed. And of course, one final question I would like to address that gets at the heart of our present zeitgeist, our present moment that is filled with so much anxiety. Why are our hearts so restless? Especially in an age where everything is literally at our fingertips and on our screens. There are no doubt other questions that could be asked, but I believe these are among the perennial questions the faith of our fathers can help us with. And of course, I only got 50 minutes anyway, so I will then conclude with why I think our present age is especially ripe for an engagement with the faith of our fathers. And so we look, first of all, at strangers and pilgrims. I think many Christians in America and Western Europe today have become quite comfortable with the cozy, quasi relationship between church and state. Christianity in many Western countries was either the religion of the state, or at least it was favored among other religions. Similar to the Christianity, I would say, of the 4th and 5th centuries, when it first became legal under Constantine, and then the religion of the empire under Theodosius I. And I say was because these days I think we're starting to look more like the Christianity of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a time when Christianity did not have a favored status. It wasn't even legal to be a Christian. And Christianity was on the defensive in many ways, having experienced sporadic persecution and then more systematic empire-wide persecutions under Decius and then later under Diocletian and his successors like Maxentius and Licinius. And then there was the plague of Galen in the 160s and the plague of Cyprian in 250 as well, both of which were blamed, among other things, on Christians. And they're dissing the gods, they're the gods of the empire. And of course, the gods were part of the civic religion in public life, and it was expected that everyone would honor them in some way, shape, or form, whether at the theater or at the games or in the military. Participation in civic life usually included ceremonies to honor the gods through maybe a pinch of incense or some other form of kind of honor that way, acknowledgement of the gods. But really, there wasn't all that much commitment, in this whole kind of, shall we say, pagan approach to the gods. All you had to do was pinch that incense or say a few words, and then you could go on with your life, kind of with how many people treat religion today, If you didn't participate, however, your neighbors usually noticed, like, posting on Instagram or Facebook. We always tell our seminary students, think before you type, And you could, be canceled by your neighbors or reported to the authorities where you might be permanently canceled. So how did the faith of our fathers respond, recognizing that they were essentially pilgrims in a foreign land? Well, the 2nd century epistle to Diognetus that I quoted earlier, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this text, it was one of the many early defenses that Christians offered for their faith, and it put it like this in a famous quote that you might be familiar with. For Christians are not distinguished from the rest of humanity by country, language, or custom. For nowhere do they live in their cities of their own, nor do they speak some unusual dialect, nor do they practice an eccentric way of life. This teaching of theirs has not been discovered by the thought and reflection of ingenious people, nor do they promote any human doctrine, as some do. Instead, they live in both Greek and barbarian cities as each one's lot was cast, and follow the local customs in dress and food and other aspects of life, while at the same time demonstrating the remarkable and admittedly unusual character of their own citizenship. They marry like everyone else and have children, but they do not expose their children. In other words, leaving them on the side of the mountain, to be abandoned. They share their food, but not their wives. Interesting. They are in the flesh, but they do not live according to the flesh. They live on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws. Indeed, in their private lives, they transcend the laws. They love everyone, and by everyone they are persecuted. They are unknown, yet they are condemned. They are put to death, yet they are brought to life. They are poor, yet they make many rich. They are in need of everything, yet they abound in everything. They are dishonored, yet they are glorified in their dishonor. They are slandered, yet they are vindicated. They're cursed, yet they bless. They are insulted, yet they offer respect. When they do good, they are punished as evildoers. When they are punished, they rejoice as though brought to life. It's a beautiful quote. Again, he wrote this in the 2nd century when Christianity was still that illegal religion, an illicit religion. And nonetheless, though, Christians were still called to be the influencers in their age. And how would they influence? Well, not just by being countercultural, since, as our writers noticed, Christians obeyed the established laws and followed the local customs in terms of food and dress and other matters. Although when the culture was corrupt, Christians took a stand. They shared their food, but not their wives. But they also had a different habitus, a different way of not just obeying the letter of the law, but a way of living that became habitual. Very much like the community here, of going the extra mile in service to their neighbor, and by that service, serving their God. Now, there's a previous document, perhaps one of the earliest Christian documents we have outside the New Testament, which spoke of there being really only two ways, two paths you can go by. But in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on, with apologies to Led Zeppelin. And I doubt the band knew the Didache when they were composing Stairway to Heaven. But isn't it interesting how, this thinking still endures? The Didache, or the teaching of the apostles, talks about the way of life and the way of death. It is an enduring idea that goes all the way back to the Exodus and Moses, frankly. There really are only two ways. And there may still be time to change the road you're on, but the fathers tell you, don't wait too long. I very much doubt the majority of them, with perhaps the exception of Gregory of Nyssa and Origen, would agree with David Bentley Hart's fairly recent book that all shall be saved. Are you familiar with this book? Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation, where he's basically saying all the fathers taught, everybody's going to be saved. Or there's Rob Bell's Love Wins. These are very popular, and both are pushing the perennial canard that both the New Testament and the fathers taught that everybody would be saved and no one is going to hell. But when you look at the fathers' sermons, their letters, and their doctrinal treatises, the fathers were always reminded that there is an end to the road, a road that leads either to death, eternal death and torment, or to life, to the undiscovered country that lies just beyond the horizon where our other and greater citizenship lies. I love that you call your house, it's De Las Peregrinas. Yes, wonderful. The fathers, there were reminders all around the place for them in a world where the average life expectancy, at least with the information I've come across, was probably well below 50. Most of us wouldn't probably be around, and probably even closer to the mid-30s, although it's hard to get firm data on that, so I'm willing to be corrected. But on top of that, they had other reminders that, whether they were martyrs being rounded up for the faith they professed, or perhaps they were in the midst of a plague that was claiming the lives of everyone around them, as Cyprian wrote about, in his On Mortality. And he had to deal with people in his churches who were saying, we're Christians. Why aren't we being spared? And I've heard that from people in our church too. Why is this happening to Christians? Everything that was happening around them reminded them that they were peregrini, that they were pilgrims, going through the land, moving on, as Dumbledore told Harry. Not settling in one place until they would get to where they were ultimately going, the final destination of union with Christ. And Karl Marx did us no favors when he conditioned us Christians not to talk about heaven, as much, because, it's the opiate of the people. So who wants to be accused of feeding crack, to their parishioners, right? Or opioids, right? But our fathers in the faith talked about heaven and the afterlife all the time. They took Paul at his word when he said that our citizenship is in heaven. As the well-known C.S. Lewis quote I have here says, from Mere Christianity, if you read history, you'll find that the Christians who did most for the present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this one. Aim at heaven and you'll get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you get neither. Beautiful words. Well, the Christian church of the first few centuries lived in a culture and society, as I say, very much like our current moment. Not only were there plagues and persecution, there was a general malaise of insecurity, there was rampant inflation, corruption in the government, and a general distrust of one's neighbors, especially if they were Christian. But there was also plenty of distractions. Sports was king. Their Super Bowl took place in the Coliseum. This one's taken place, in L.A., right? Somewhere, I think. Yeah, and probably the more violent, the better is how we like our sports, and they did too. And of course, sex was queen, if the graffiti in Pompeii is to be believed. As I like to say, it's quite revealing, literally. I don't know if you've seen the website, boy. And you know what they say about having 50 words for snow up in the north? Well, it was the same with the Romans in sex. They had 50 words for every kind of prostitution you could do too in Latin. So, and by the way, those parts were all excised out of the post-Nicene fathers. I find that interesting that wait a minute, that they just took it out, or they put it in Latin. And if you could read Latin, you realized what it's actually saying. And it's NC-17, some of that stuff, yeah. So, that's kind of the world they were living in. And not everybody, of course, was pleased with the state of affairs. The Stoics had their ideals, as did other elements of the intelligentsia. But the tide of the culture was hard to resist. According to Kyle Harper's From Shame to Sin, there was a constant bombardment of erotic art infiltrating the public space, and the bath seethed with promiscuity and prostitution. And while they may not have had the internet to promote their pornography, society and culture were still structured to tempt. And if not to tempt, then to distract. And if not to distract, then to coarsen and desensitize. So one response to this of the bishops of the early church was to preach and teach against the onslaught. So you've got Cyprian, as I mentioned before, a 3rd century bishop in the prosperous city of Carthage, who told his people, "Our warfare is with greed, with immodesty, with anger, with ambition. On top of that, there is our diligent but toilsome wrestling with carnal vices, with the enticements of the world. The mind of man, besieged and in every quarter infested with the onslaughts of the devil, can scarcely meet the attacks, the point of attack, scarcely resist them. If greed is humbled, lust springs up. If lust is overcome, ambition takes its place. Pride puffs up, drunkenness entices, envy breaks unity, jealousy severs friendships. There are so many persecutions," he says, the soul suffers daily. With so many risks is the heart wearied, and yet it delights to bide here, along among the devil's weapons. Yeah, an earlier father of the church, Clement of Alexandria, finished his ministry about the time that Cyprian was born. And in his day, he said Christians needed to live among these temptations in their cities as if they were living in a desert, so that they wouldn't be pressured into conforming to their environment, but instead choose to exhibit a life lived justly. The desert became the training ground for spiritual athletes like Anthony or Abba Macarius, who would go out into the desert to do spiritual battle with themselves, but also with Satan on his own turf, so to speak. Many people would go out to them into the desert to consult these Abbas and these Ammas too. Give me a word, they would say, some grain of wisdom people would ask for. And I remember one account in particular that we would often use when we're talking in Africa, talking about ascesis, or a spiritual discipline, which is the art of training oneself spiritually, similar to what athletes do who prepare for the Olympics. And I was walking along yesterday, and I saw this T-shirt that said, stop exercising and start training. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of what the desert was really trying to talk about too. And in his book, Desert Spirituality and Cultural Resistance, Belden Lane talks about the role the desert played as a kind of teacher or coach that teaches those who seek its wisdom about apatheia, which he defines as a fierce indifference to unimportant things. They came to the desert, he says, to learn not to care about what is unimportant, so as to begin to care about what really matters. What do you learn to ignore, and what do you learn to love? They spoke of these as the 2 great desert questions. And there's a story connected with these questions that Belden Lane talks about. And I've read this story in the Sayings of the Fathers that I'd like to share with you. A brother came to see Abba Macarius the Egyptian and said to him, "Abba, give me a word that I may be a holy man." So the old man said, "Go to the cemetery and abuse the dead," which is just a bizarre thing, right? So the brother went there, abused them, and threw stones at them. All right? And then he returned and told the old man about it. And the old man said to him, "Didn't they say anything to you?" And he replied, "Well, no. So the old man said, "Well, tell you what, go back tomorrow and praise them." So the brother went away and praised them. calling them apostles, saints, and righteous men. And then he returned to the old man and reported what he did. And the old man asked him, well, did they not answer you? And the brother replied, no. And the old man said to him, you know how you insulted them and they did not reply, and how you praised them and they did not speak? So you too, if you wish to be saved, must do the same and become a dead man. Like the dead, take no account of either the scorn of men or their praises, and you can become a holy man. And I tell that to my students when we talk about their sermons after greeting people, you know. You hear, oh, great sermon, Pastor. Well, don't let that go, or terrible job, you know. Well, the desert asks two questions, right? What do you ignore? What do you learn to ignore? What do you learn to love? Those are, I think, 21st century questions that the faith of our fathers can help us answer. And this is true, especially in an age when everyone everywhere is vying for our attention. I mean, and with, you know, the email, the texting, the Snapchat, and TikTok videos, all that stuff. I mean, there's so many things in our devices that have so many ways to get our attention. And we have a different type of attention deficit disorder. We always got to be checking something, you know. And the fathers teach us to be still, you know, not to be swayed by those things. So I'd like to talk to you a bit about narratives. I've got a couple sections on this. The narratives of salvation with the Gnostics and Arius. You know, when I was teaching at the university level, I often heard students say, I'm spiritual, you know, but not religious. You ever hear that? You know, right? And I go, oh, okay, whatever. No, sorry. I try to take it seriously. But, you know, it kind of took me a moment, you know, to figure out what they're saying, right? You know, being religious meant, of course, being part of a church, part of a community, and they wanted none of that. And being spiritual meant they could chart their own spiritual course, which usually ended up looking a lot like themselves, you know. That's what I found out, and their desires. The last thing they wanted to be told was that there's anything such as authoritative truth or an authoritative institution like the church. Forget that. What I found rather fascinating, though, even as it was rather also depressing, was that when my students operated this way, it seemed that whoever had the most convincing story, you know, the most convincing narrative was the one who ended up controlling what they believed. You know, and I think this is why Hollywood and movie stars, you know, and all these influencers we hear about today have such a profound effect on the collective human psyche in the West. I think there's something to that. You know, and the church is familiar with competing narratives. The first few centuries of Christian history saw many competing narratives, especially concerning these different ideas of salvation that were rampant and frankly attractive among the Gnostic sects and the mystery cults that were prevalent at the time. People then, as now, were searching for God in all the wrong places. For the first few centuries, Orthodox Christianity, I don't think it was the dominant narrative, frankly. It was illegal, subversive, and rather exclusive in its claims. You know, it was not a recipe for success. And yet it thrived, or at least it endured, I should say, in this rather competitive environment because it understood that truth is truth, but meaning is contextual and can adapt to different societies and cultures without doing away with the central truth. And the early church understood from early on the truth of the message that one's relationship with God begins and it ends with the one who came down for us and for our salvation from heaven and was incarnate. That's how the fathers of Nicaea stated it. He was not just a spiritual being inhabiting a body. He was as much a physical human being as you or me. And a lot of people had trouble with this. This understanding of the God-man, Jesus Christ, was at the center of the Christians' lives and at the center of meaning that they found in their lives and in the texts that they treasured. Not everyone was comfortable with this idea of an incarnate God, you know, who took on flesh, this stuff. You know, the Gnostic narrative, for instance, was generally speaking, and I speak in general terms because there's lots of different Gnosticisms out there, but it was about an inert God in heaven who stayed there, but generated a whole spiritual universe of reality, shall we say, filled with layers and layers of heavenly beings existing on these different levels of heaven, almost like a video game universe, it seems like to me, you know. And along the way, something went terribly wrong in this metaverse. Some texts refer to it as something akin to an abortion. And matter then came into existence from a mistake, basically. And along with matter came physical human bodies that imprisoned the souls so that it couldn't ascend back up. And the goal of Gnostic teaching was to escape the body and get back to the spiritual ether, the playroom, if you will, that spiritual realm where true spiritual fulfillment could be found. And it was a very elaborate cosmology. I gave you a couple of them here. You probably can't see the small print there. It's hard to fit it all in, right? Very elaborate cosmology they were offering. And Gnostic guides would parse the signs and show you the way up from the demiurge and the material world and into the spiritual world of the pleroma, and imparting this kind of secret spiritual knowledge alone that only they could know. And one of their favorite texts to use was the Gospel of John, which talked about the Logos, or the Word of God, which they could put you in touch with, in order to free your mind, and the rest would follow, and free your mind, your spirit. The body was something to be escaped, almost like an appendage, a roadblock to truly finding yourself. And to me, that sounds like how people are kind of treating the body today. Many today are trying to do the same thing, to escape the bodies that they were born with. And that's a narrative, and it's an attractive one at that for those who feel trapped in their situations, or in their bodies for that matter, and wonder how to get out or how things got so bad. But there was another way, another alternative narrative, shall we say. And this brings us to Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, around 177 AD, after his own bishop and a number of people in the church were martyred for their faith that year. He became quite familiar with Gnosticism and even included many of their elaborate schemes in his work, The Refutation and Overthrow of Knowledge Falsely So Called. And then he got an editor and they changed it to Against Heresies, sorry. So he took apart the Gnostic narrative and exposed Gnosticism for the lie that it was. He detailed how their exegesis, I love how he describes this, they weave ropes of sand. Think about that, as they reinterpret the scriptures to fit their elaborate schemes. And they take the beautiful mosaic, he says, of a king and rearrange the tiles in the shape of a dog. He's talking about a narrative there of how they take the gospel and rewrite it in a sense, reconfigure it. In other words, they create a new narrative that has nothing to do with the original one, the Spirit-inspired one. The Gnostics said the flesh was evil and an impediment to fulfilling our ultimate destiny as spiritual beings. Irenaeus countered that the Word, God himself, became flesh, clothed himself in it, and redeemed not only the soul but also the body, as he offered up that very physical body on the cross. Redemption was about the sacrifice of God that God himself made in the flesh for us, not some artificial ascent, spiritual ascent through a fantastic array of made-up spiritual beings constructed to enable us to realize really the promise that Satan had given to Adam and Eve in the garden. You can know God. Just follow my way, right? So Irenaeus wanted to confess that God did indeed take on human flesh and made it life-giving even. Irenaeus calls it the medicine of immortality, which Christ offers to us in the Eucharist. The Gnostic narrative, while it denigrated the flesh and created matter too, Irenaeus' narrative reveled in the both, as he spoke of the two hands of God, the Word and the Spirit, who are forming man from the dust of the ground, getting those hands dirty, if you will, with the earth that God had pronounced good in his created order. And so the 21st century, I think, is afflicted with what I like to call a flight from the body. The competing narrative about what it means to be human, let alone what it means to be a man or a woman, has much more in common with the Gnostics than with Irenaeus or Scripture and the Genesis account. But it is attractive to those who are spiritual but not religious. And it has even, frankly, made inroads among the religious, in the church, as far as that goes, too. So there's a second narrative that I'd like to talk about, this one between Arius and Athanasius, as we've already heard some about this with Professor Heron's paper. Because Gnosticism ended up dying out around the 4th century in most parts of the ancient world, probably partly because the narrative just couldn't hold up, because it wasn't based on the truth. But the 4th century had the seeds for another even more powerful narrative when a seasoned presbyter from Bacchus, a suburb of Alexandria, charged his bishop with teaching false doctrine about the Logos. This presbyter used a rather Neoplatonic cosmology That, like Gnosticism, included heavenly beings who populated the spiritual realm. And I'm not saying Arianism is Gnosticism, but there are some, parallels. And one of these heavenly beings in the spiritual realm just happened to be the Son of God, the Logos, who served as an intermediary between God and the created world in Arius' schema. Arius even put him in a different category than the other heavenly beings, saying he was not part of creation as commonly understood, but still had come into being before the creation of the world. As he put it, there was when he was not. And so the Logos, the Son of God, was a divine being, but he wasn't God, because he hadn't always existed like God did, Arius thought. He's not eternal. And when you've got a spiritual world filled with divine beings, to say that this was a demotion for the Son of God, that's a bit of an understatement, And Arianism, too, offered a different scopus, a different hypothesis, a different narrative than the Orthodox. The reason why Arius had such a difficulty with the Logos being God was that when the Logos became incarnate, he suffered. He died. He had all manner of indignities, including that suffering and death, which, of course, God can experience. And so he reasoned that the Logos must not be God. And he also thought that since the Son of God had become incarnate, then he must have undergone change. So Scripture itself tells us God cannot change. Therefore, again, the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, he can't be God. He would even ask women in the marketplace, did you have a life before you had kids? No, I'm just kidding. That's what my wife always says. And I don't have a life anymore, No, actually, his question was more like this. Did you exist before you had children, before your children? And the answer, of course, is yes. Well, so then he'd say, doesn't it make sense that just like parents exist before their children, the father existed before his son? Parents always exist before their kids, so therefore there was a time when the Son did not exist. And you see the logic. It's a pretty convincing narrative, frankly. My question is, why is this so important for Arius? Arius has protected, really, in his mind, the essence of God, God's being. He's protected God from any type of contamination with the human world or with creation itself. The Logos is not of the same essence of God. He's not homoousios, as you mentioned. The whole purpose then of the Logos, this heavenly being becoming incarnate, is to show us the way to the Father. By going through the incarnation, the birth, the subjugation to his parents, later on the humiliation, the suffering, and even death on a cross. And Athanasius kind of details this out in, I think it's book 3 of his Contra Arianos. He looks at what Arius is presenting, and he's saying he did all this in Arius' mind so that he can be exalted by his Father with that name that is above every name. So Jesus Christ, the Logos, the Son of God, paved the way for our exaltation. And if we follow that example in his teaching, we too can become, gods like the Son did. But he could never be God, just like we can't. And to be fair to Arius, this is how Athanasius describes the Arian narrative. So we don't actually have Arius's writings, in his own words, because Constantine had them all burned, But from other Arian documents, it would seem to be largely accurate, although Athanasius did have a tendency to kind of conflate various Arian protagonists, we'll just put it that way. I think when a lot of people first hear Arius's argument, their reaction is very similar to Emperor Constantine's. This is all a bunch of logomachy, not malarkey, but logomachy. That is, it's an argument. It's an argument over words. You say tomato, I say tomato. Let's call the whole theological thing off. Some have even argued that Arius' concern is more cosmological than soteriological. In other words, more about how he conceived of the world than how he conceived of salvation. Perhaps. But Athanasius and his bishop Alexander realized that the very gospel was at stake in this narrative. This explains why the words "who for us and for our salvation" were included as a central point of the Nicene Creed in its wording. Both Gnosticism and Arianism have at least one thing in common. They both start from below with a creature who needs to work his way up to God. But Irenaeus and Athanasius have their starting point from above. with a God who comes down, as the creed put it. I mean, literally, he condescends, but in a good way. I mean, the Greek word for this is synkatabaino, which literally means God comes down to be with us. God is the starting point, not us. And he did all this for us, not for himself. As Athanasius put it in his On the Incarnation, God saw our plight. He saw what a mess we had made of things, and he decided to do something about it rather than just let us sit in our corruption, ignorance, and shame. By eating of the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve had disobeyed the one law God had given them and thereby introduced a curse on human existence that included not only, first of all, death and being subject to corruption, but secondly, also ignorance even of who God is. Where before God had walked among them in the cool of the day in the garden, now the slightest word scared them to death, thinking God had come to punish them. It was God who chose to do something about their condition because human beings were powerless to do anything about it themselves. And there were any number of things Athanasius says that God could have done, such as just, wipe the slate clean and start over and call the whole thing off, or just pretend it didn't happen and give them a do-over, right? But none of these would have satisfied his justice. And by the way, I don't know what the Greek word is for do-over, but, So God does the only thing he can do, Athanasius says. He takes on flesh, takes a body which he received from the Virgin Mary and makes it his own. He does this so that he can address those two problems that Adam and Eve had introduced into his perfect world: the corruption and death of our physical existence and our ignorance of God. He takes on a mortal body that can die in order to make a sacrifice in answer to their sin, but a body that will also be joined to him, the author of life, so that he can enliven our dead bodies with his own life-giving flesh. And the body is also something that can be seen and can communicate the mind of God to his people once again. By his incarnation, the Word made flesh can redeem humanity both from its corruption and also from its ignorance, and even make us, this is amazing to me, make us sons and daughters, gods by grace from the one who is God by nature, Athanasius says. And he comes through his obedience to death to restore the image we had lost through our disobedience to life. And Athanasius has a beautiful picture of this that he paints for us in paragraph 14 of On the Incarnation. He says, "For as when a figure painted on wood has been soiled by dirt from outside, it is necessary for him whose figure it is to come again so that the image can be renewed on the same material. Because of his portrait, even the material on which it is painted is not cast aside, but the portrait is re-inscribed on it. In the same way, Athanasius says, the all-holy Son of the Father, being the image of the Father, came to our place to renew the human being according to himself, and to find him as one lost through the forgiveness of sins, as he himself says in the Gospels, I came to seek and to save that which was lost." Human beings, he said, could never have accomplished this on their own, even though they were the ones who had brought this on themselves and therefore needed to address what they had done. Since they couldn't, however, the Son of God did so for them by becoming a human being himself. He became what we are so that we might become what he is. This is the opposite narrative of how most in our world operate, let alone Arius. Arius, the Son of God, could not have accomplished all this because he wasn't God. He was an exalted, even divine being, but that's it. Athanasius realized that our situation was so bad that only God himself, the one who is homoousios with the Father, of the same substance as the Father, could do this. Arius' incarnate being was just a better version of us, frankly. He was a son of God, but not the Son of God. He could teach us and show us the way to the Father, but he wasn't himself the way, he wasn't the truth, and he wasn't the life. Neither the God of the Gnostics or Arius wanted to get his hands dirty, but the God of Irenaeus and Athanasius not only got his hands dirty, he got right there in the trenches with us. He endured the deepest, the darkest moments of our existence, and even gave up his life all so we could know what it truly means to be human. I mean, that's the thing about Jesus. He shows what it really means to be a human being, because he was fully human in every way as we are, yet was without sin, as Hebrews says. He could show us what it truly means to be human and know that we will live again with our bodies at the resurrection because of his life-giving flesh, that our bodies are going to be there with us. We don't just leave them behind, floating around. Our 21st century narrative is so saturated with COVID right now, that we forget that death does not have the final word, His incarnation, that's our reminder of the kind of God we have in a world that has largely forgotten God, not just forgotten who God is, but frankly has forgotten him altogether, as Solzhenitsyn put it, in his 1983 Templeton speech. But we've also forgotten what we were originally created to be. We were created to be, not just to escape our bodies or just to exist, but to be those daughters and sons of God, with all that means. And that's frankly why I think our hearts are still kind of restless. Kind of wondering. They're restless until they rest in him, which is, of course, what another African bishop knew who was born right in the middle of the Arian crisis, frankly, in 354. Augustine, the restless heart. And, of course, Augustine was born in 354 in North Africa in the village of Tagaste. And you all know his biography, I'm sure, how he strayed from the faith. I remember I had one student who wrote a paper for me on Augustine, and she said, he just liked sex. And I said, well, there were a few other things he did too, but, she kind of, that's what her idea was of Augustine. Yeah, he did stray from the faith, looking for love in all the wrong places, looking for God in all the wrong places too, frankly. And to me, his mother, Monica, is the patron saint of all mothers and fathers, for that matter, who worry about their children who have strayed from the faith, when they send them off to college, see what happens, right? She prayed for him every day. And those prayers, they were answered, right? When he was baptized by Bishop Ambrose in the Cathedral of Milan at the age of 33 at the Easter Vigil in 387. And so when I talk about the faith of our fathers, I also, of course, talking about the faith of our mothers too, and the wonderful gifts that they are to us and to our, to the church. And of course, he famously wrote his confessions. In his confessions, you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. But he was only echoing what David had said in Psalm 62. My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. I'm so glad you guys do the Psalms, It's such a beautiful gift that we have. Why was he restless? And, for Augustine, it's not as though his parents didn't provide for him. It's not as though they didn't give him the advantages, in life. In many ways, his life reminds me of Solomon, who tried to find fulfillment in all the different things that life has to offer, whether it was sex or alcohol or power, fame, possessions, his profession, whatever it might be. At the end of the day, his heart, though Solomon found out, was still restless, and he saw that all he had done, what could he say about it? It was vanity, empty, which is what many people feel today, I think, too. All is vanity. Well, Augustine was pretty much the same way until his baptism under Ambrose's tutelage. He had tried out sex and even had a child out of wedlock. He also tried out Manichaeism and Neoplatonic philosophy, which he thought would satisfy him, but he couldn't get any satisfaction, shall we say, until he heard those words of the children playing when he was in the garden at the house of his friend Veracundus in Cassicium. Remember that? Tolle lege. Take up and read, take up and read. Yeah. So Augustine took up the book that was in front of him, and played what I like to call Bible roulette. It's a dangerous game, but reading the first passage that he saw, which was from Paul's letter to the Romans, the 13th chapter, right? Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. Well, if this doesn't show the power of books, and the importance of libraries, I don't know what does. The encounter with the book, changed his whole life as the Spirit did his work, and then he changed the whole face of Christianity, and he's still influential to this day. Because his life was introduced to a different narrative, the exact opposite of what he'd been living and doing. He was provided an answer to the spiritual warfare that had been going on in his own soul. And he encountered something that was not only countercultural, but something that brought him to an encounter with the one who was the goal, the end of his pilgrim journey. That text, that book had done something to him when he read it. And it wasn't for him just signs on the page, as he says, that he saw. Those signs became the reality that they pointed towards. So I'd like to bring to conclusion here. This is the essence of patristics, and I believe patristics has something to offer the 21st century. It's not just about texts. It's not just about people who lived a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's about what happens when we let the way the fathers think, write, do things, affect how we think, how we write, how we do things, like Tom Oden experienced. We no longer are just interpreting a text from a long time ago. The text begins to interpret us. Ken Perry put it this way. He kind of makes a similar point in his introduction to the companion to patristics. He says, patristic literature can convey a dimension beyond the immediate text that obliges us to meditate upon the meaning of what we have read. The words may inspire us to go beyond the literal sense to a level of reflection that is not easy to define, and perhaps impossible to define, given the mystical nature of the message being conveyed. Just as the fathers contemplated Scripture and absorbed it to become living exponents and witnesses to its meaning, he says, so in turn they imbued their own writings with multiple layers of meaning, compelling us to explore more fully the implications of their words. The fact that the fathers continue to attract our attention shows the power of their message to engage us. Now, scholars who study patristics, and patristic exegesis in particular, which is where I like to kind of spend my time, I think we get this. We understand that there's a deeper engagement with the text, one that often reaches right down to our very inner being, our very soul, perhaps even changing us after the encounter like it did with Augustine. In my dissertation, I called this a sacramental reading. When you engage in sacramental reading, whether it's Scripture or some other text, the purpose of that reading is not only to inform, but of course to form. And I think the church fathers would say that a lot of the biblical exegesis and studies that are done, often practiced today by many, they'd say it's more like an autopsy, of the text. Concerned with, shall we say, the dead letter of the text rather than its spirit. Patristics and patristic exegesis moves us away from autopsying the dead letter of the text to the spirit of the text and what the Spirit is doing to our hearts when we engage the Word, which the fathers understood really as engaging Christ. The text of Scripture was and is meant first and foremost to, as I say, form the reader into a believer in Jesus Christ. And this, of course, is what the Apostle John says in chapter 20. These are written, right, so that you may believe, and by believing, you may have life in His name. Secondary goal is to inform the reader, but that formation is so important. And the dedication of a new library, and one as rich as this one here at St. Michael's, that has been, that has these two wonderful collections from two fathers in the faith. Oh, it's the place for such an encounter, an encounter with the Word, which points us to the Word, who came first and foremost for us and for our salvation. And I love the fact that you've got in the glass case there, you have Martin Luther's signature right there for us Lutherans to kind of be part of this too. So I rejoice in that too. But, this encounter with the Word made flesh is what to me makes patristics important for the 21st century. The faith of our fathers teaches us how to read the Word, but also how to allow the Word to read us. It reminds us that most, if not all, of what we're going through in our present moment, it's happened before. This is not the church's first rodeo, a mixed metaphor if there ever was one. The faith of our fathers holds out the hope that the church will not only survive, I really believe it can thrive once again. And one other benefit that I didn't put in my list that I think the fathers teach us, and it's a benefit of the fathers, is that they're for all of us. Whether you're Lutheran, Catholic, Orthodox, we can all claim these fathers. I had one radio program where I was being interviewed and, I was talking about Augustine, and a Catholic listener called in and said, "You can't have Augustine, he's ours." I said, well, Luther was an Augustinian monk, there is that. But I do see the fathers as kind of that bridge, and I know Tom did, to see it as kind of a way for us to have a common text to talk together about what really is important in the life of the church. And that's a wonderful gift that we have. So just to conclude here, You know, as you can probably guess, I took the title of this paper from a well-known hymn, a hymn that is sung across denominational lines. The tune's composer was the 19th century organist and composer Abbey, and the hymn, I'm told, was originally written to honor one of the martyrs of the early 4th century, Clement of Alexandria. She was an 18-year-old girl who was beheaded during the persecution of Maxentius in 305. And she not only refused to deny her Lord, but according to the martyrdom accounts, she was actually able to convert many of the philosophers and sages in the emperor's entourage when he came to celebrate a pagan feast there in Alexandria. So her faithfulness, even to the point of death, reminds us of the faith of our fathers and our mothers, a faith that is living still. And so let me conclude with the words here. Faith of our fathers living still in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whenever we hear that glorious word. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, for the fun dip into the fathers to remind us just how much they have to offer us still and always will till Christ comes in glory. We have time for just a few questions in case anybody has a question. Brother Titus.
So both you and Dr. Hull mentioned how the fathers are common to the Orthodox, to the Protestants, and to the Catholics. And so my question is kind of an ecumenical question, which is, in your experience, have you noticed a different approach to the fathers between the Orthodox and the Catholics and the Protestants?
Yes and no. I mean, in the sense that I do find sometimes we look to the fathers to find confirmation for what we teach, and what it's in our confessions. I look at my own tradition, for instance, which I can speak from, that Luther, of course, was never looking to leave the church. He was looking to reform it. And our own Lutheran confessions, for instance, have a whole what we call a catalog of testimonies that seeks to show how our faith and life is consistent with what the church has always taught. I do see kind of a tendency, let's say especially in the life of worship, where there are some differences that way. One of the questions that often gets debated in evangelical circles, for instance, is whether the historic liturgy should have a part in the life of the church or should it be more, kind of free that way. And of course, if you look at the fathers, it's pretty consistent that there was an ordered life, of worship that we had. So I do find that some things kind of get ignored, and in one tradition, if it doesn't quite make our point, that is kind of true. Growing up in the Lutheran church, we never talked, as I said, much about church history. But we're starting to discover that our Lutheran Reformation reformers all were very, very well versed in the fathers and shaped and formed by them. And so in our case, it's kind of a rediscovery of what we've always had. In our case, and perhaps in others too. I mean, it's a great question. And when we did the commentary project, I remember, even different editors would kind of have different emphases that they'd like to emphasize, in the fathers too. And you can only include so much. I suppose there is some of that. But what I see happening too, though, is the fact that you're even reading these fathers and getting acquainted with them does deepen the conversation, and it does, how shall we say, put it on a different level in terms of really looking to the historic faith as something that grounds us in that tradition. I gave a paper at the Vatican on scripture and tradition, so we got into some of that, as to, Lutherans would disagree that there are two sources of, authority. We would say scripture, and then, tradition is subservient to it. And looking at Dei Verbum, it was kind of like they were parallel kind of authorities. And we had some difficulty with that, shall we say, but we understood. I mean, I read Avery Dulles' article about this, that really even that tradition is still formed by scripture, is what he was making the point at. So I think if nothing else too, it also causes us to actually listen to each other more, instead of just kind of, we caricatured Catholics a lot in the Lutheran tradition, especially where I grew up, and so encountering with that common text, shall we say, has caused me to really appreciate much that goes on in the Catholic Church. And I hope it was a little bit vice versa too. Yeah.
Question today. Yes, Frater Raphael.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts about St. John Henry Newman's reading of the Fathers, his interpretation, and his eventual conversion to the Catholic faith. Because
Yeah.
anytime I think of the ecumenical conversation and how much it deepens, and that was so much a part of his life, is how he could see good things in the Anglican faith, and then how it eventually brought him to Catholicism. So if you have more thoughts on that, I'm most curious.
Yeah, well, I guess I probably do. And talking with Tom Oden about this too, because we'd both be asked, so when are you going to swim the Tiber? And I said, well, I got to get my life vest first, and then something. No, because we have Richard Newhouse, for instance, who was a graduate of our seminary, and Robert Wilkin is another case, and of course then we had Jaroslav Pelikan, who went to Orthodoxy. So Lutherans are known for their swimming, that way. But, to my mind, I still think there's a place for our Lutheran tradition in the one church Catholic, in the sense that we still have an emphasis on that justification issue, shall we say, and also our view on the sacraments that I think is a witness that's needed in the larger church. And so I haven't really thought about taking a dip myself. I'm pretty comfortable with what we're doing. And we have our own problems. Boy, I recognize that. And, my seminary had a walkout in 1974, over the issue of the Bible and things, for instance. But I still do think I don't see, and I think I talked with Tom about this too, that we don't necessarily have to have institutional unity. I think I conceive of it differently in the sense that it's still a one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And it was after 1054 also. And after a few other schisms that happened too. So I think God uses those to actually have iron sharpen iron, and to clarify theology rather than gloss over the differences, which is what we saw happen in the 60s and 70s, with WCC and some of those things. I thought they're just glossing over what there's still problems. So I don't know, that's kind of how I look at it.
Thank you. It's good. Chris, if you had a word about that, yes.
Yeah, I know, and he did swim, by the way. Yeah.
He's still swimming, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
So, on Easter Vigil, I'm going for a swim.
I knew that.